Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're taking a deep dive into What My Bones Know, a memoir of healing from complex trauma by Stephanie Fu. We've got these powerful excerpts, and our mission is to explore them through an academic lens, pulling out the crucial insights about the nature of complex trauma, how it connects to the body and mind, and what this deeply personal journey reveals about the challenging path toward healing. It's one person's story, but offers such a vivid case study for understanding broader scientific and therapeutic concepts.
Right. What's fascinating here is exactly that interplay, how a personal narrative makes these complex research ideas feel incredibly real. We're going to use the details Stephanie shares in the source to understand not just what complex trauma looks like, but why it impacts long-term health, brain function, and the entire process of recovery in the way that it does.
Right. So let's set the stage by looking at her early life, the environment that really shaped her experience, as detailed in the source. She moved to the U.S. from Malaysia before she was 2, growing up in a home with incredibly high parental expectations. You see descriptions of intense educational pressure, her mother even interrogating other PTA moms about the most educational activities.
And yet the source also gives us glimpses of what on the surface might look like a more typical suburban life: barbecues by the pool with expat friends, trips to the Chinese Vietnamese diner, even playing Pictionary. It paints this picture of a home with perhaps a stark contrast between what was presented outwardly and the difficult dynamics playing out privately.
And those dynamics are really laid bare in the source. The verbal abuse from her mother is relentless quotes like, "You look like an asshole. No wonder all the kids at school hate you," accusations of not being sorry. She describes a senseless loop where she'd be trapped for hours apologizing, followed by screaming, then silence. And the physical toll on her mother is noted, her voice warbly, vocal cords shredded from screaming.
It's striking how the source also includes the author's speculation about her mother's possible unfulfillment, wanting a job at the bank, dismissed by her father. While not excusing the abuse, it's presented as part of the environment, an adult assumption that layers context onto the situation.
Then there's the father's abuse, which she describes as less frequent but terrifyingly ruthless. The physical beatings being grabbed by the shirt, thrown against the wall, then bookshelves with threats like, "I'll crush you," and the emotional abuse like calling her just like my mother.
The car incidents sound particularly harrowing from the source. The father yelling, "Get in or I'll kill you," driving at 65 in a school zone while saying, "We're going to die."
Mm.
You read how her response evolved: initially prayer or panic, then shifting to this strange calm, just quietly waiting for the car to stop so she could escape.
Yeah, there's even the intense moment described where she threatened him with an axe. What's really impactful early on is her description of not even knowing how I felt about all this, guessing it probably felt fucking bad.
Yeah.
From an academic standpoint, that immediate dissociation or inability to access emotional processing is such a clear indicator of the trauma response already kicking in, right?
Absolutely. That difficulty with emotional identification and regulation is a hallmark we see discussed in the literature on complex trauma. And the source really shows how she carried that forward into coping mechanisms, particularly in her teenage years and early adulthood.
Exactly. The coping strategies she developed are quite telling. Staying up online until 4 a.m., fan fiction, chat rooms, message boards. It's a form of escape, connecting in a safer space, but it clearly had physical consequences like falling asleep in class, dizziness.
And then journalism enters her life, becoming this incredibly significant coping mechanism and source of value. The intensity of it: homework from midnight to 6 a.m., editor duties. It wasn't just a hobby. She writes in her diary, "Thank God I got EIC so I don't have to kill myself anymore." It was a lifeline, literally.
Right. It became her way to right wrongs, providing a sense of purpose, and it even got her into UC Santa Cruz, despite a low GPA because of her portfolio. But even college brought new challenges, and her coping evolved, confronting misogyny and racism by developing aggression as self-defense, this "I am not a girl, I am a sword" mentality. Chasing a guy with a bat. It shows how that survival instinct translated into outward behaviors.
Yeah, definitely. Despite achieving external success in work and relationships, the source repeatedly mentions this persistent internal feeling of a horrible, rotten core. What does that inner experience tell us about the legacy of complex trauma, even when someone is outwardly thriving?
That feeling is so common in survivors. It speaks to the insidious nature of chronic abuse that targets identity and self-worth. It manifests as recurring dread, anxiety, a constant need for external validation, second-guessing, how was I supposed to be?
And as the source details, it fueled a cycle of overwork and using substances to manage the distress, emails and swig whiskey, empty bottles lining the foot of my bed.
And the relationship struggles she describes, feeling misunderstood, men pulling away herself, but often ending up in this vulnerable, shameful, pleading mess.
Yeah.
It's a pattern we see where past trauma affects attachment and connection. Then she introduces Joey, who takes a different approach, forgiving her sins, telling her she was enough as is.
Right. That acceptance becomes a crucial foundation.
This journey brings her to a really pivotal moment described in the source, receiving a diagnosis that starts to put a name to these lifelong struggles.
Yes, the CPTSD diagnosis at age 28 after 8 years of therapy. Her therapist delivers it casually, and initially the author dismisses it. How bad could it be?
But then she researches it, Googles the symptoms, trouble holding jobs, relationships, and recognizes her own wreckage. The search for stories of healing, I healed from complex PTSD, yield minimal results, reinforcing a feeling of being different. The, quote, hurt people resonates deeply.
Acknowledging the painful reality of perpetuating cycles of harm.
This leads her to key literature, like Pete Walker's work, focusing on the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, trauma responses, and the inner critic. And Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which she engages with later regarding specific therapies like EMDR and the ACE study.
What's really highlighted from these sources is the distinction between traditional PTSD and CPTSD. Traditional PTSD often stems from a single event with clear triggers, but CPTSD, as the source describes, comes from thousands of traumas, often ongoing during developmental years,
Right.
making the triggered state more or less constant, a fixed state of being, the dread.
And the author notes how the academic literature sometimes portrays CPTSD sufferers as more problematic, focusing on their faults and failings. There's also the idea presented that healing is harder for adults than children, whose brains are considered more flexible.
So this diagnosis provides a framework, but also comes with these potentially pathologizing narratives that she has to navigate.
Understanding that framework really involves looking at the science, how chronic developmental trauma physically shapes the brain and body over time.
And the source delves into this, referencing the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. It powerfully illustrates the correlation between high ACE scores and significantly worse adult health outcomes. Liver disease, cancer, heart disease, emphysema, alcoholism. You see the sheer magnitude of increased risk with higher scores.
But the source is careful, and rightly so, to discuss the nuances and limitations mentioned in her research. It's an epidemiological study. It shows population-level correlation, not individual destiny. There's significant wide level of variation.
Right. And she points out how learning about it could lead to stigma, anxiety about toxic stress physiology, or misclassifying individual risk. Her personal reaction initially was intense anxiety, obsessed with my imminent demise and existential crisis, feeling robbed of future life.
She also explores specific brain science. Trauma survivors often have an enlarged amygdala, that fear center. Emotional abuse is linked to a shrunken or thinner prefrontal cortex, specifically areas associated with self-awareness and executive function. Childhood sexual abuse is connected to smaller somatosensory cortices, impacting the ability to sense one's body. Even an altered response to sound is mentioned after being subjected to constant screaming.
This paints a picture, as discussed in the source, of the brain being like a predictable computer programmed by experiences. The author feels she got flawed code from evil programmers, her parents.
Yeah, and there's the instinct to delete the bug, which brings up past suicidal thoughts. But she realizes that her healing efforts, particularly her journalism, have woven her into the world, giving her a reason to stay.
And there's this striking detail linking childhood trauma to physical conditions like endometriosis, one study cited showing an 80% increased likelihood. The source also makes a powerful point about the historical and recent dismissal of women's trauma in the medical community. Yes, from Freud's retraction of his theory about child sexual abuse to the historical reliance on male-only mouse studies in PTSD research, the potential impact of hormonal cycles on trauma encoding and memory bias adds another layer of complexity.
This scientific understanding is crucial for validating the experience. But the core of the memoir is the active process of healing. The source explores various modalities she tried.
And finding therapy itself is presented as a significant hurdle, the cost, insurance issues, just finding a therapist who's available and feels like the right vibe. It's not a simple step for many survivors.
One therapy she delves into is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Bessel van der Kolk is quoted describing it as processing rather than just talking, with the goal of rewriting the memories in the brain. It sounded abstract to her initially.
She recounts her first EMDR session with her therapist, Eleanor. Eleanor asks about dissociation, watching herself from outside, not knowing how she got dressed. They look for a disturbing memory, the B-sides of my trauma history. She even decides to re-trigger herself by watching the movie Mommy Dearest.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah. The session description is vivid, the buzzers, the safe place visualization, and the vision that emerges during the processing is incredibly powerful. Joey confronting her parents, telling her child self, they don't love you.
And she describes feeling immediate relief. Maybe I'm cured, but then the return of the dread, the familiar sixth-day slump, shows it's not a one-time fix.
Exactly. Mindfulness and self-soothing are also common recommendations in the literature, but she struggles with an overactive mind, what's called the default mode network, or DMN.
That's right, the DMN. The science explained in the source is that the DMN is the brain's autopilot, fueling internal focus and rumination. And it's quieted by things like external focus, antidepressants, hallucinogens, and mindfulness practices like grounding.
She describes her restorative yoga experience as particularly impactful, using props, being forced to focus on body sensations, even the instructor's quirky guidance like breathing through your butt nostrils.
Chuckles slightly.
Oh, staying in poses for long periods, visualizations. This leads to a powerful emotional release, tears, feeling cradled, safe, cared for.
It's a realization of how much pleasure she missed by being constantly in my head. The connection between accessing body sensations and quieting that DMN is really clear here.
Absolutely. And grounding techniques like holding an ice cube or eating wasabi are mentioned as ways to force that external focus, interrupting the internal loop.
At this stage, she characterizes practices like mindfulness, grounding, and gratitude as feeling more like palliative care versus curative care for her. She also mentions exploring psychedelics, specifically shrooms, as a temporary tool that provided perspective and peace, but noting their limitations in terms of temporary effects and access.
This process of trying different modalities and understanding the science brings her to a point where she needs to anchor her internal experience in external reality, leading to this powerful decision to return to her childhood home to fact-check her memories.
Yes, the source details this return to San Jose. She questions her own memories of the abuse and her community's experience, knowing how trauma, dissociation, the veil of dissociation, can impact memory.
She describes the emotional impact of seeing the transformed landscape, like the gorge, as evidence of how that dissociation had stolen her appreciation for beauty.
And the powerful moment of sobbing at a Chinese restaurant, King Eggroll, realizing the depth of what her trauma had taken from her in terms of simply being present for her own life experiences.
Conversations with former teachers reveal this spectrum of awareness. Some show a naivete about student struggles, focusing solely on grades. But speaking with Yvonne, who experienced psychosis, self-harm, homelessness, and gangs, provides a starkly different, candid perspective.
Right. Yvonne's experience highlights how trauma can be overlooked, perhaps especially for Asian American kids, despite severe symptoms.
And this conversation with Yvonne provides a huge sense of relief and shared reality for the author, the feeling of being a product of a place. Finding empowerment and realizing her experience, while deeply personal, wasn't unique or solely her fault.
It normalized her pain within this broader community context.
The source then expands on this community context by introducing the concept of intergenerational trauma. She researches her family and community history, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, Vietnam War, Korean War, Cambodian genocide. She connects her parents' characteristics, stoic, anxious, quiet, to potential trauma responses passed down, noting the difficulty discussing this kind of trauma within the community itself.
Specific family history details linked to this ancestral trauma are shared. Kay's mother's paranoid episodes possibly linked to losing uncles escaping Vietnam, H's father's anger linked to surviving the Gwangju uprising, her grandmother's imprisonment during the Malayan emergency, the threat faced by her grandfather from the MNLA. These details illustrate how historical trauma is woven into the fabric of families.
And then there's the incredibly powerful encounter with Auntie, her father's sister. Auntie confirms the family knew about the abuse. Everybody knows that you suffer a lot. And she explains the heartbreaking reason for not intervening. You say anything who suffer, your father, and if we say, she would beat more.
Wow. That's heavy. It was a calculation made out of a different kind of survival thinking.
Exactly. Auntie offers another perspective, suggesting the praise, Hogwa, Hogwa is so well behaved, was perhaps meant to show the mother the author was deserving of love, or perhaps to show the author herself. Auntie's view that life is like that reflects her own incredibly difficult history. A great-great-uncle losing a fortune, a great-grandmother raising daughters alone through sheer grit, tailoring and selling food.
It puts the current family dynamics into a much larger historical and cultural context of endurance.
The author initially saw her family's coordinated deception and elevation of her achievements as a complex form of love, but this perspective is deeply challenged by discovering another layer of her father's deception.
And this discovery comes years later, learning about her father's second family. He just referred to his girlfriend as my friend. The shock of not being invited to his wedding, not even being told.
The source describes the intense emotional impact of the Tower photo incident, seeing a family photo with her photoshopped out, feeling like a dark anomaly, embodying blood and sin.
The sum total of my parents' regrets, their greatest shame. It's a profound representation of feeling deliberately excluded and pathologized.
Attempts to confront her father about the past are described as futile, feeling unheard. His defensiveness, his inability or unwillingness to see the past from her perspective, his walking away saying, "I'm through with this."
This leads to estrangement, and she describes it not as a miraculous fix, but as allowing her to accept that she wouldn't have his love or acknowledgement in the way she needed. Far from peace, but it is what it is.
Yeah, there's a sense of mournful acceptance there.
This ongoing search for healing continues with different therapists after Samantha. There's a brief, unsuccessful attempt with Mr. Sweatervest, who wasn't the right fit. Then she finds Dr. Ham through a project proposal, and this therapeutic relationship proves to be transformative in different ways.
Therapy with Dr. Han is described as challenging, even blunt, but ultimately supportive. He's seen as a weirdo, but kind, trustworthy. His approach is highly focused on specific interaction patterns. She falls into categorizing people, trying to fix others, making things about herself, negativity, the automatic apology reflex.
He observes her hypervigilance, how she presumes his meaning, interrupts, struggles to sit with discomfort.
There's this crucial realization that her strong anti-excuses stance clashes with the CPTSD diagnosis, potentially offering a clinical excuse or explanation. She wants unconditional love, but paired with no bullshit.
Right. Dr. Ham is described as a close reader on life, using the analogy of editing trauma out of the conversation, like being a meticulous reader of E. E. Cummings' unusual poetry.
This approach helps her learn to ask questions when she's confused, rather than defaulting to pretending she understands or apologizing reflexively. She also learns from observing healthy interactions, like a play monitor calmly setting boundaries with foster kids Jeremy and Nico, explaining that needing space doesn't mean lack of love.
And she applies this insight to her own relationship with Joey, needing space for herself, doesn't diminish her love for him.
Navigating conflict in relationships is a key area where the healing is tested. Her triggered reaction to Joey's look of exhaustion or fury. Dr. Ham gives her prescriptive advice on expressing needs without nagging. Phrases like, "You cannot die on me, please take care of yourself for me." It shifts the dynamic.
Yeah, and the source introduces the idea of a two-way street in relationships, acknowledging mutual impact, with the difficult but honest phrase, "You hurt me, and yes, I hurt you, and I'm sorry, but you're still mine."
It's about taking responsibility while also holding on to the relationship.
A powerful insight comes from watching a father-daughter therapy video in session. The father's self-hatred and self-punishment are shown to be blocking connection. The daughter voices her need for attunement, telling him, "Don't go that far. Be sad about what happened, but don't go so far as to say you're a bad dad."
Right. The shift happens when the father is finally able to feel and express a lot of love towards her right now. The physical impact described is incredible, a frigid timber changing, anger melting, embracing.
It leads to the realization that punishment didn't make things better. It mucked things up even more. And critically, self-punishment isolates.
She applies these tools learned in therapy to workplace conflict, finding alternatives to her default of self-punishment using food, meditation, talking to a trusted friend instead of thinking, if I were a kinder, better person, she wouldn't feel like she hates me.
It reinforces the need for both internal practices and external support.
Another key element is understanding and allowing emotions. Drawing a circle of allowed versus not allowed feelings visually represents her internal restrictions.
Yeah. Happiness, anger sometimes are okay, but stressed out, sadness, helpless and stupid, are outside the circle.
The realization that feeling difficult emotions like loneliness or sadness is normal, and allowing them even just by watching TV without guilt or eating cookies without guilt when feeling down actually leads to feeling better.
It cultivates the ability to feel sadness and joy concurrently.
The importance of support systems and found family is powerfully demonstrated leading up to her wedding, enlisting friends and family to help with tasks like folding paper cranes.
Her wedding speech is a moment of integration, acknowledging the pain, thanking her found family, choosing forgiveness and acceptance.
And Joey's speech reveals her past support for him, highlighting that her capacity for deep connection was always there.
The idea emerges that she wasn't inherently broken, but was in survival mode, and perhaps the beast of her trauma response also provided strength and insight.
She connects her personal struggle to collective and ancestral trauma, feeling she had been there microscopically through her genetic code and the experiences of her grandmother and ancestors.
Right, and during the Japanese occupation, sewing flags, facing poverty, sexism, racism, wars. She recognizes her own survival as part of a larger historical endurance.
The Chinese saying about the world being divided into thirds, heaven, earth, and feng shui, human action, is interpreted as implying human agency in that third part, which includes the possibility of healing.
The source ultimately portrays healing not as a cure, but as an ongoing practice learning to muzzle the beast. It requires integrating multiple tools, grounding, curiosity, talking to her child self, utilizing techniques from therapies like IFS and CBT, using mantras, setting boundaries.
And it's acknowledged that there will be times she falls back into old patterns, facing new challenges. Healing is presented as a continuous fight, deeply informed by understanding brain science, community context, and history.
It's important to note the source takes a moment to acknowledge the specific people who provided support along the way. Taiku Ma, Sam, Auntie, Grandma, Margaret, Deco, Jemmy, and Katie are specifically listed as part of that crucial support system.
Absolutely vital.
So what does this all mean when we step back? This deep dive into Stephanie Foo's memoir shows us that complex trauma healing isn't about finding a simple fix or erasing the past. It's a continuous, multifaceted process of integrating, understanding your personal history, your collective history, the scientific impact on your brain and body, and actively using multiple tools, from therapy and mindfulness to the absolutely crucial support of others.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it powerfully reinforces the profound physical impact of childhood adversity on long-term health and well-being. It underscores why recognizing and addressing complex trauma is vital, not just for the individual, but within families and communities. It also leaves us with this important question to ponder. If much of the clinical literature initially focused on the difficulties and perceived faults of those with CPTSD, yet the author's personal journey reveals immense strength, hard-won insight, and the capacity for deep connection through her struggle, what does that tell us about the narratives we, as a society and within clinical fields, construct around trauma and recovery?